All right, y'all, welcome back. Today we're going to continue Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. So this is going to be chapter 20 or XX of Dominion, Paternal, and Despotical. So the point here is that he's trying to analogize the family to his theory, basically. Um, and he says, we've talked about it before, but he sort of points out the major difference between the Commonwealth by acquisition and the Commonwealth by institution, right? And it's about the fear present in the society. The Commonwealth by acquisition is a fear of the powerful leader, right? Or a tyrannical dictator, or the Gestapo, or whatever you want it to be. Whereas in a Commonwealth by institution, it is a fear of every man against every man and civil war. So it's more of a compact between them. The same rights of sovereignty apply to both, according to Hobbes. Just because you're a commonwealth by acquisition doesn't mean you have different rights of sovereignty. And then he has sort of an interesting discussion of sovereignty as it relates to marriage. It's kind of before his time. He goes against most of sort of modern society at that time, modern for the time, contemporary society, and says that the only reason that men tend to receive custody of their children in this time period, because men overwhelmingly receive custody of their children, at least in Europe during this time, was because men created the laws, right? And that the laws were inherently sexist. And that women should actually get custody. So this was a very controversial idea. And he says there's two reasons. One, because they're the only ones who were able to truly prove their parentage. And then two, because women nourish children and men tend not to, and thus kids have more obligation to their mother than their father. Um, and then he moves on and he says those who are ruled by despots in which they do not enter a covenant, so this is like the slaveholder relationship, do not have an obligation to nonviolence, but not necessarily to commonwealth by acquisition, because those agreed to be ruled. Even though it was under the fear of death, they still agreed to it. So some interesting distinctions. Okay, we'll move on to chapter 21, XXI, of the liberty of subjects, and then I'll shut it down and we'll start a new one for the next chapter because this one's pretty long. So here he wants to know the main question: what is freedom and what is liberty, right? And he says first, okay, let's talk about freedom. And he says a free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do is not hindered to do what he has a will to do, right? So this guy is again really complicated in his language, but he's saying if you're able to do it and you are not hindered in doing it, then you are a free man. In many ways, Hobbes is sort of asserting here that men don't actually have free will because all of their actions are based on context and history. So this ties in really heavily to the Calvinist perspective of the time. For those of you who don't know what Calvinism is, Calvin was a philosopher from either Denmark or Switzerland, somewhere in Northern Europe. He was a philosopher and a sort of Protestant Christian who believed that men don't have free will, that every act that men take and every thought that men think is generated by God before they were ever born, right? There's a story written out. God shows your path. You can't actually earn your way into heaven because God already decided whether you were going to go to heaven or not. So that's sort of the Calvinist approach, right? There is no such thing as real free will. Um, and so he's sort of tying his argument into the Calvinist approach. And he says, excuse me, he says, yet because every act of man's will and every desire and inclination proceeds from some cause, and that from another cause, in a continual chain, whose first link is in the hand of God, the first of all causes, right? So he's doing this take it all the way back to the beginning kind of argument that was pretty common for the time. So that him that could see the connection of those causes, the necessity of all men's voluntary actions would appear manifest. And therefore God that seeth and disposes all things seeth also that the liberty of man in doing what he will is accompanied with the necessity of doing that which God will, and no more, no less. So he's, again, taking this very Calvinist perspective, like men don't actually choose their own life. Okay, so what is liberty? And he ties this again into more Calvinist philosophy. He says, and did not his will, God's will, assure the necessity of man's will, and consequently of all that on man's will depends? The liberty of men would be a contradiction and impediment to the omnipotence and liberty of God. And this shall suffice as to the matter in hand of that natural liberty, which only is properly called liberty. The liberty of a subject lies therefore only in those things which, in regulating their actions, the sovereign have predetermined or pre-permitted, such as is the liberty to buy and sell and otherwise contract with one another, to choose their own abode, their own diet, their own trade of life, and institute their children as they may think fit. So he's saying, you can do whatever you want within the boundaries that the state has set for you. That is liberty. As amongst masterless men, there is a perpetual war of every man against neighbor, no inheritance to transmit to the son, nor to expect from the father, no propriety of goods or lands, no security, but a full and absolute liberty in every particular man. So, in states and commonwealths not dependent on one another, every commonwealth, not every man, has an absolute liberty to do what it shall judge. That is to say, what that man or assembly that represents it shall judge, most conducing to their benefit. But withal they live in the condition of a perpetual war, and upon the confines of battle with their frontiers armed and cannons planted against their neighbors round about. Okay, so here he touches on another very modern concept of economics, actually. And this is Waltz and Mearsheimer's international relations work that suggests that we live in an anarchic society, that there is no overpowering international body of law or sovereignty, and that every state is a, quote unquote, man unto itself, right? And so this is, he's touching on all of these modern economic and philosophical ideas. He doesn't really know quite what they mean or how to propound them further or to sort of operationalize them, but it's very interesting to see him talking about some of these things. And then, so given all this, when does the citizen have a just claim to reject a sovereign's orders? And he gives us a whole litany of stuff. First, Hobbes says we must know what are the obligations of the citizen to the state when he enters into that covenant with a sovereign. Okay, so number one, a man may always protect his body against death. This is a little confusing because this is antithetical to Crito, right, that we read earlier, and a little antithetical to some of the things he was talking about earlier with the sovereign having absolute power over men. But, again, we'll move on. Number two, men have, they didn't call it this at the time, but a Fifth Amendment right against self-testimony, right? This is a very important part of the American Constitution, and it is thought that this is where this originated, the idea that you do not have to testify against yourself. So we instituted it in America in the Fifth Amendment. Okay, number three, the sovereign must be doing the greater good for his commands to be just. So this is where we're kind of getting into the obligations of the sovereign itself, that they must behave and rule accordingly with justice. Number four, you may reject military service, though the sovereign has a right to execute you if you do. Number five, if you're a criminal, you can be put to death for your actions by the sovereign, But you do have the right to defend yourself, though others do not have the right to defend criminals against the sovereign. So this goes to the first point. You can protect yourself against being killed. Number 6, if there's not a rule against it, men can take the action. So if there's not a specific law, then men have that liberty, which was what he would call it. Number 7, the citizen has a right to sue the state and to trial, just as he does against other citizens. So the sovereign can actually be brought to court as a litigant and must stand trial. Number 8, the obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasts by which he is able to protect them. For the right men have by nature to protect themselves when none else can protect them, can by no covenant be relinquished. So what if the state starts to fall apart and cannot protect the average citizen, the covenant crumbles. Number 9, prisoners of other nations have no fealty to a sovereign who catches them and therefore tries to escape. Number 10, if no heir is named, sovereignty is disbanded and the obligation is cut. So there has to be a clear line of passing down the sovereignty, right? Number 11, banished subjects no longer enter the covenant, right? So if you've been exiled, then you're not a citizen anymore, and you have no reason to conceive them as your sovereign. And number 12, the transitive property applies if a sovereign is defeated. So this is really problematic with like colonialism and conquer and etc. He's saying it's not proper for for you to set up a covenant by acquisition, right? He said that earlier, and yet he's saying like, well, if your sovereign conquers someone, like in colonialism, then obviously it's transitive. But that's problematic because he just argued that like acquisition by the sword it is not just. So I have a problem with that too. Okay, I'll leave it there, and then we will talk about chapter 22 in the next one. Have a great day.